Hi, this is Steph Rockneck. I'm going to talk a little bit about making, actually the technical aspect of making the Poe Returning to Boston sculpture. So just first to situate ourselves, this is a drawing that I made when I initially applied for the project, and it's Poe Square, and it gives you an idea of the narrative behind the sculpture. So the sculpture, Poe is walking towards a building where his family once lived, and it may have been his birthplace while he's dismissing his Boston critics, the Frogpondians behind him. And the train station that he often used is nearby. So my idea was to have Poe coming home, and as he dismisses that part of, those parts of Boston that he didn't like famously, just off the train. So this is a friend of mine, chemistry professor at Hartwick, who actually grew up in Wellesley, Massachusetts, posing for me in my attic. It's just a rough idea of what I was thinking of. So I translated this into the wooden model that is 19 inches tall, and this is 2011. To make the sculpture more dynamic, I added wind. And the raven is larger than life, which is suggestive of Poe's reputation, while the idea was to have Poe life-size, sort of, this was his relationship to Boston wasn't great, so he's not really a larger than life figure in that regard, but in regard to his lifelong reputation, he is larger than life. So here's another angle of that here, and there's he's just off the train, but I have his writing spilling out of the back of the trunk, not only to make this more interesting to the viewer, but also technically to give a third point of contact on the ground, because I knew at this point that if I happened to be selected, that I knew that people would climb on this, even though there's a sign in front of it that they're not supposed to climb on it. This would just make this a stronger sculpture. So here's another angle of the initial wooden sculpture, and that was sort of affectionately called the debris pile behind him. But it was determined that that would be a tripping hazard, which it would have been. So what I did for the actual final sculpture was move that heart up onto the pile of papers, and none of the papers are curved up, so you can walk on them, and there's no tripping hazard at all. So again, this is in the initial stages. I photoshopped an image of the wooden sculpture, with an idea of the patina, the green patina on it, into the sculpture. And this is pretty close to where the actual sculpture is. And that's pretty close to the size to the life-size 5/8 sculpture. Is actually a little bit bigger than that. And again, here's another of the initial photoshopped images, the trolley shop there, and the grate and the tree. And one of the reasons for keeping this sculpture life-size, not only because he's, what I talked about earlier in regard to his relationship to Boston, the infrastructure beneath the square is very complicated. And, for any sculpture, above ground, you have to have a giant foundation below ground to make sure that that sculpture doesn't move in the weather, people climbing on it, or just sitting there. So this was the size of the foundation, at least, that had to be put underneath it, and it just barely fit in this infrastructure. So there's gas lines, there's electricity, etc., and none of that could be touched. Not only couldn't be touched, there had to be a distance. When you dig a hole, you can't dig right next to it, especially the gas lines. So here is the wooden model being shipped off to Texas, and there was a lot more packing put around it. That's just the initial crate that I built for it, and placing it in there because it was enlarged, digitally enlarged to styrofoam, and then I put clay on top of that. So we'll go through that process now. So here is the styrofoam enlargement that arrived back at Skylight Studios in Woburn, Massachusetts, and they built scaffolding for me and also cut it into the pieces that it needed to be cut into, because they were doing the molds for me. Actually, the molds were done in Chelsea, but they cut it into pieces for me. And then that's how it was shipped back to New York to my studio. And then also I could separate the clay, which is going to go over this, so I could ship it back again to Massachusetts. So here it is going to New York in a rental truck that I rented, and they actually had to cut the head off to go into the back of the truck, which Poe might have appreciated, or maybe not. So here it is. I did the head, started the head up separately, working from photos pretty closely there. And the talk that I give in Boston, I'll show you some overlays of the likeness and the photo that I used to create the head. So here's adding the clay, and I had to carve some of that styrofoam down because when you enlarge anything, all the mistakes show up. So I made some changes. So there's knives on the ground here on this little sculpture stand that I created, so I can move it around the shop. There's wheels on that, so I could twirl it around. And I created initially the raven. Didn't create it. I put the clay on separately. You can see coffee cups in all of these. My Dunkin' Donuts coffee cups. I think I was addicted to the pumpkin spice here. This was the fall. So laying that clay on, and it's probably about an eighth of an inch to a quarter of an inch, depending on how much I cut away of the styrofoam. And I had to keep that clay heated to make it malleable, and it was getting colder out. So the door is closed and the heat is on in the shop, and keeping that clay warm. Here, and again, creating pieces separately. Here are the papers coming out of the back. And adding a lot of detail to that I hadn't been able to make on the 19-inch model. So here, packing the clay figure, so I took it apart again and using that inner scaffolding structure that they created for me in Woburn, because it's got to go in a truck and go back to Massachusetts to the foundry. So here, creating a crate for the trunk so it doesn't get damaged on the ride back. So here it is. This is December. It's negative 15 degrees. And rented another truck to drive it back to Massachusetts. So here's everything that arrived safely back in Chelsea. This is New England Sculpture Services, where the molds were created and it was actually cast and finished. So I had to put this all back together, so then they could cut it up and cast it. So I put it all back together and fixed all the seams. So here's the finished life-size clay sculpture, and this was in December 2013. And I photoshopped a green patina on there. So this is the clay sculpture, much more detailed than the wood. Here's a close-up of the clay. And here you can see the progression from the human model to the 19-inch wooden sculpture to the styrofoam to the actual clay. So then they've got to cut these pieces up again, following the lines of the original scaffolding that was built for it in Woburn, so they can make molds and cast it. So here are the clay pieces cut up, very carefully placed on that piece of rubber there. And then what they do is they pour rubber on the clay, and then which creates an exact negative of the clay, and then they pour plaster around that. And then they take wax and swish it around in the rubber to create a wax positive. It's kind of like an Easter egg. So, and that's hollow. That wax is hollow. And then they peel the rubber off of that to create these wax positives, these parts. So then I had to spend about a week going over all the wax positives to make sure that no mistakes had occurred from the translation from clay to wax. And then what they're going to do is cast these pieces individually. So to do that, they're going to pour what's called a slurry. There's sand and plaster. I'm not sure of the exact formula here around these wax pieces. So that's the raven with this slurry poured around it, and that wax is inside it. So it's encased in that. And then what they do is they put that in an oven and it melts the wax out. So then there's a hollow bit inside this casing that they can pour the bronze into. So, and that they pour it through that cup on the top. So here are all the pieces. You can see that off to the right with the cups on the top. They cut away the top of it so the cup is open. And then what they're doing is they're heating up the bronze here, and they're getting ready. Dan, he's getting ready to direct them over to this area where they can pour that into these cups. And that's what they're doing. They're pouring it here. And once it is cooled and hardened, they take and knock away with a sledgehammer the plaster, that slurry that was originally encased the wax, and then they have the bronze pieces. So then they need to be welded up. I didn't do any of that, but I supervised it. So here is Dan welding up those pieces, and then they have to, grind away the weld marks to make it as much like the original clay as possible. There's a stainless steel structure inside of the piece. Paul Lewis and I were insistent that they give it the strongest structure possible, because again, we knew that people would be climbing and leaping on this, even though they're not supposed to. And indeed they are. If you go and see the sculpture, even though there's a sign that says don't climb on it, they are climbing on it. And this goes looking down the legs. So this goes all the way up the spine of the raven and down the legs and into the body of the piece. So here you can see it going up the raven. So this is very strong. And then clamping all these things together was quite complicated, and welding it, more of the stainless steel structure inside, because again, this is hollow, be way too expensive and way too heavy to have a solid bronze piece. Here is applying the patina. And this is us a little bit before applying the patina. We all signed the inside of everybody who worked on the piece. And there were a lot of people that worked on the piece in terms of making the molds, supervising the whole process, welding, and doing the bronze. So we inscribed it inside. So again, talking about the foundation, here's that giant foundation. They had to dig a hole first and remove all the brick, and then put this giant rebar structure in the hole, and then they filled that with concrete. There are plates attached to the top that are attached to the rebar that then are attached to the sculpture. So it's very solid. So here is Poe riding through the streets of Boston at 5:30 a.m. Just to avoid traffic in public. Here they are placing it over. You can see at the bottom here the rebar, the rebar coming out of the sculpture is being attached to the plates. And that's me beside it. I'm 5'8", so I am illustrating the exact height of the sculpture in the walking pose. And here it was encased in a wood box, so the public couldn't see it until we unveiled it. And here is Shawmut laying the brick back down. And this is actually at an angle. The sculpture's walking downhill, but putting it under the feet so it looks like he's walking on the brick. So that brick goes on top of the concrete block that you saw there, and feathering it in with the other brick in the square. So here's Shawmut setting the trailing pages into the ground. Those are firmly permanently installed into the ground, so they can't be pried up. And here is the finished sculpture. It looks like he's walking, and there's the 3 points of contact. Here's the back. Again, you can see the heart on top of the paper, as opposed to being behind it, which was the initial idea. And that's definitely a better idea to have it there. It's less likely to be stolen, and that is solidly attached as well. Here's a detail shot of the trees, more detail shots. Here's one of the trailing pages. Here is the plaque that's attached to the wall nearby. It's near the trolley shop. It's not on the trolley shop, but it's nearby. It explains the sculpture and some of the donors. And here's the progression from the human model to the wood 19-inch wood model to the styrofoam sculpture to the clay to the final bronze. And here are the three Poe sculptures. First one was in Baltimore, 1921. That was installed. The second was installed in 1959 in Richmond. And then finally, this one was installed in 2014. So I hope you enjoyed that, and that was informative. Thanks for watching.